One of the key criticisms for world making is that it is a history of great, mostly men, just not Western men.
Does this kind of risk a kind of retrospective fatalism? So is there a version of this story where different choices about violence or about nation-state formation or economic strategy, whether that could have altered the trajectory, right? Or whether these contradictions are actually structural? So the three contradictions that you highlight with Sukarno's world-making project specific to Sukarno, or really are they contradictions of anti-colonial world-making more broadly?
It's not a history of Indonesia, it is a history of Sukarno.
Your idea where Indonesia during Sukarno's later tenure is characterized by this three-headed monster between the army, the communists, and Sukarno, it's become one that I think I'm going to make a very big claim here, is that I've never been convinced by that picture, right? And it gets reproduced everywhere.
Today, in Indonesia, through Sukarno's ideas and the Bandung conference, no longer seems to represent third worldism, as you wrote, or the spirit of decolonization. After Sukarno, Indonesia seems to have joined the mainstream neoliberal political order.
As the Prime Minister of Indonesia back then who initiated or who actually had the idea of the Bandung Conference and later being supported by Nehru, I don't see Sukarno was truly central.
It's a wonderful initiative.
The Global South Network opened new horizons for judicial cooperations.
Global South Network provide a platform for meaningful dialogue and cooperation, fostering efforts to build a more equitable and resilient legal landscape.
GSN network continues to expand areas of activity, further strengthening its impact and reach.
The universal concept of justice compels us to join our efforts, and this is the forum for promoting the same goal.
Well deserved for the hectic activity you have made. I am astonished, I am amazed, I was impressed.
May I at the outset commend you, Dr. Ayad, for the immense work that you're doing in the GSN, and the Global South Network is a much admired initiative.
It's commendable. South Network focuses on all disciplines and regions, creating a bridge between academia, civil society, legal community, etc.
We are being criticized for doing our job and for upholding the federal constitution. Like I have said in the past, I will not bend to such lame pressures and insinuations.
Dr. Norman Riat, the founder and convener of the Global South Network, visionary leadership has established a vibrant forum where judges, academics, and practitioners from around the world can share and exchange ideas.
I would like to point out that Dr. Riat's initiatives have not only enriched comparative judicial dialogue, have also fostered mutual understanding of the diverse challenges that courts face in safeguarding the rule of law and constitutionalism.
After all, what would you do as a colonizer from the global north, conditioned by a systemic othering mindset and driven by economic lust built on commodification, including the commodification of human beings?
This last question is not so easy, a bit complicated.
The Global South Network provides an important space to share experiences and learn good practices from one another.
dialogue takes on particular importance thanks to Global South Network, which allow us to believe in a better world of the rule of law.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 17th seminar in Phase 5 of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the Global South Network. I would like to start the session with some introductions. I'm Dr. Nouman Riayat. I'm a lecturer in law at the Leicester Law School, University of Leicester. I'm the founder and chief convener of the Global South Network, and I've been running these PhD in Progress sessions since March 2023. It's a pleasure to chair today's Global South Network PhD in Progress session, and I look forward to learning about the presenters' research and engaging in the discussion that follows. I'm joined by two discussants and two peer commentators. Dr. Patrick Neveling is the first discussant for today's session. Dr. Patrick is a senior lecturer in social science at the University of Bournemouth. He completed a Magister Artium pre-Bologna reform in cultural anthropology, Indonesian philology and philosophy from the University of Cologne, and a PhD in social anthropology from Martin Luther University, Halle-Wittenberg. His thesis, Manifestations of Globalization, Capital, State, and Labor in Mauritius 1825 to 2005, develops a global historical anthropology that advances the understanding and critique of colonial, plantation-driven, racialized capitalism and post-colonial sweatshop, labor-driven neoliberal capitalism. Dr. Patrick's second major research project, the otherwise neoliberal special economic zones in a global history of capitalism, uncovers neoliberalism as a political economic praxis that emerged on the peripheries of the world economy in the special economic zones of 1940s Puerto Rico and 1960s Singapore and Taiwan, for example, to today's more than 5,000 zones in 147 nations. Dr. Jye Bowman is the second discussant for today's session. Dr. Bowman is a teaching fellow in modern history at the Department of History, University of Warwick, and his research centers around histories of anti-colonial print. His forthcoming monograph, entitled Writing Against Empire, applies a book history approach to 20th century empire, and in particular, the Pan-African movement. He is currently working on a new book project focusing on the League Against Imperialism. This short-lived anti-colonial activist group counted many interwar internationalists as members, such as independent India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, Indonesia's first President Sukarno, Kenyan President Jomo Kenyatta, and millionaire communist media baron Willy Musenberg, as well as well-known public figures like physicist Albert Einstein and author Upton Sinclair. Roqiyul Maarif Syam is the first peer commentator for today's session. Roqiyul is a PhD candidate, Kent Law School, University of Kent. Roqiyul's ongoing research seeks whether legal and institutional apparatus facilitate or resist the erosion of popular sovereignty as a fundamental principle of modern constitutional democracies, including Indonesia. Didan Habibi Ali Al-Fatimi is the second peer commentator for today's session. Didan is a PhD candidate at the School of Politics and International Relations, University of Leicester. Didan's doctoral research is around the topic of space policy in the global space age, with Indonesia and international relation theories as the main point of interest. Prior to his study, Didan was involved in research projects on Indonesia's participation in the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's seminar, Jye Quah, who is a PhD student at the Department of Politics and International Relations, University of Cambridge. His ongoing PhD dissertation seeks to theorize post-colonial socialism through the political thought of statesmen in Indonesia and Singapore. Today, Jye will present part of their PhD project titled An Anatomy of Worldmaking Sukarno and Anticolonialism from post-Bandung, Indonesia. He will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, followed by 5 to 10 minutes of comments from our discussants and peer commentators. If time permits, we will then open the floor for a 15-minute question and answer session with the audience. Jye, we are delighted to have you with us today. The screen is now yours.
Thank you, Dr. Nauman, for having me and the time to read the published paper to fill in any gaps that they might have. And then hopefully we can have a longer discussion. So the paper is titled Anatomy of Worldmaking, as you can see on the screen. It mainly wants to intervene in the literature in political theory, which is where I base my own scholarship. But also intellectual history, international relations, post-colonial studies, Southeast Asian studies. As mentioned, it's already been published. It forms a chapter in my dissertation, but of course, as when you have a chapter out of your dissertation, is always a bit of a tricky thing to reframe it and so on. So today I'm presenting the publication version of it. So it will be decontextualized from the larger argument of post-colonial socialism that I'm trying to pursue. Right. The task that I set myself here is to analyze Sukarno's anti-colonial politics after the recession of empire, especially after the Second World War. And the paper has 3 interventions, but I think I'll focus on 2. I'll try to fold them into 2 for today. The paper really is a historical paper, but it's organized into different dimensions to have some sort of analytical intent. And that leads me to, next slide, to my first intervention, which is a conceptual intervention. A lot of us who work on these fields of post-colonial theory, international relations, political theory, will have noticed the vocabulary of worldmaking being very prevalent around. And it's really through this book that you see by the political theorist Adam Getachew, and her book basically of the worldmaking worldmaking after empire. It wants to argue that anti-colonial nationalism is not simply a struggle for national independence. Decolonization had far more radical, far more ambitious aims. It was really about remaking international order, and worldmaking is supposed to denote that impulse towards remaking of international order. But ever since Getachew's intervention, the concept of worldmaking has become very capacious, and it's led to what I term as a conceptual overextension. In the scholarly literature, worldmaking now refers to institutional design, political imagination, legal reform, finance, love, counterinsurgency, botany, all sorts of different things. And so basically, we're going further and further away from the conceptual core of what worldmaking was supposed to be. And so my paper, what it wants to do is to try to disaggregate worldmaking and without reducing this generative character, its richness, to be able to spur many different lines of thought, but also to be able to still retain its analytical grip. So I want to disaggregate worldmaking into 3 different forms, right? And I do this through Sukarno, Indonesia's first president, already mentioned today, during his tenure of guided democracy, 1959 to 65. And my argument basically is that Sukarno's anti-colonial worldmaking has 3 dimensions, or at least 3 dimensions. Discursive, through the use of political language to reorder the concepts that underpin world order. Institutional, creating alternative institutions. And dramaturgical, which is, I guess, the most difficult, but using spectacle, performance, architecture, symbolic action to try to stage a new world. The second intervention, I guess, is disciplinary or regional. Sukarno is a major figure within 20th century anti-colonial politics, but in political theory, in IR, he is unintegrated, or in fact, in many ways, completely missing, almost completely missing. Sukarno, as I think I don't really have to introduce him here, but he's born in 1901. He was considered Indonesia's founding father, anti-colonial freedom fighter, and of course, he already had this reputation before independence, and after independence becomes president. But what I want to focus on here is the later tenure from 59 to 65, which I think has received less attention. And most importantly, I think he was central to the whole Bandung Conference project, which I think we all know, and then later central in his attempts to radicalize third world politics. But despite all this, English language scholarship has tended to marginalize him, and the area studies literature has tended to downplay his theoretical contributions. So this paper wants to treat him differently as a serious anti-colonial political thinker and taking seriously the conceptual structure of its politics. And I think this matters because Southeast Asia is often marginal in discussions on the Global South, anti-colonial internationalism. Classic figures tend to come from Indian or Black Atlantic spaces, so Nehru, Nkrumah, Fanon, and so on. And in this paper, I also want to use Nehru, or I have used Nehru as a moderate foil to show how Sukarno has consistently out-radicalized Nehru and therefore shows a different path of anti-colonial internationalism. And he complicates this scholarship because he shows that the international order, there was an attempt to rethink international order from outside the UN. Sukarno increasingly saw the UN as setting limits to decolonization rather than facilitating it. And so his world-making project also became a sort of world-unmaking project of trying to dismantle institutions rather than create new ones, or rather to do both at the same time. So put together, the broader claims that Sukarno gives us a Southeast Asian route into debates on anti-colonial political thought, and he gives us a version of anti-colonial world-making that increasingly moves outside the United Nations rather than through it. Bandung is the starting point of my paper. It's treated, Bandung Conference, I think we all know what it is. It's often treated as the symbolic high point of third world solidarity. It brought together all sorts of different concepts: anti-racism, decolonization, South-South solidarity, an incipient idea of non-alignment, and so on. But in the paper, I tried to use Bandung not just as a symbolic event, but as introducing these three dimensions of world-making that I had earlier introduced. So first, I take Bandung as a site of discursive world-making. Sukarno's opening speech, which is cited everywhere. Everybody refers to Sukarno's opening speech, but nobody really has sought to dig deep and contextualize it, and also its movement. What it does is it didn't just want to describe world politics, but actively intervene in it. It wants to change how we see the world, and from there change what sort of actions are permissible or not. The most important thing that he did is to use this concept of, or introduce this concept of the moral violence of nations, right, in favor of peace. So at this point, anti-colonialism for Sukarno and third worldism has this idea of peace attached to it. The third world is supposed to be mediating between first and second world. Mediating between first and second world as a way of peace, trying to ensure nuclear war doesn't overwhelm global politics. And so with this discursive world making, he's trying to set what the terms and objectives of the third world are. Right. So it's all about moral pressure at this point. That's Sukarno's third worldism at this point. Second is Bandung was a site also of institutional world making. This is, I don't get to choose main use of world making here. The conference itself created a platform. It made Afro-Asian solidarity, third worldist solidarity visible and organizationally possible. So by providing a diplomatic infrastructure from which newly independent and still colonized peoples, though not that many, within the conference itself, could imagine themselves as part of a collective political subject. So basically, it's a space to convene. It provides an infrastructure for third worldist politics. That's a different sort of world making that I'm pointing to here. And the third one is dramaturgical world making, which I draw a lot from this historian Naoko Shimazu. Is to take Bandung not just as a diplomatic meeting, but as a stage. The Bandung as a city was prepared, the speeches were performed, visual symbolism mattered a lot. It worked as a form of political theater where the audience could move closely to the actors, your statesmen and so on, and so feel themselves as part of this third worldist project, amongst other things that other theatrical metaphors and so on that were used. So Bandung gives us a template for how dramaturgical world making might unfold, right? As a sort of performance, as looking at Sukarno not just as making speeches, but as an actor on the world stage, so to speak. But what I want to do in this paper is to show that after Bandung, Sukarno takes these three dimensions of world making, discursive, institutional, and dramaturgical, into more radical directions. And so from there, show different forms of dimensions of world making and allow us to disaggregate world making. So the first one is discursive world making, basically the use of language to try to intervene in world politics, right? Here I look at Sukarno's speeches, especially from 1960 onwards. The key shift is the shift from Bandung's language of the moral violence of nations, of peace, and so on, which I elaborated on earlier, into an antagonistic theory of world politics, right? In Bandung, he speaks of peace, but in 1960, by the time of... Okay, actually, I should contextualize this. I think this is more important. Here, by 1957, Sukarno and the Indonesian leadership is very frustrated over the status of West Papua or West Irian. Sukarno believes that to fully decolonize, that territory has to be taken into the body of the Indonesian state. But there's a lot of big controversy about this, I'll get to that later. But the UN negotiations tended to be slow and ineffective. So this shaped Sukarno's view that institutions like the UN did not enable decolonization but constrained it. So from then on, his speeches become more and more radical. They look, instead of the Cold War as the organizing frame of 1960s global politics, but as colonization, colonialism and neocolonialism as the central danger facing humanity. So he argues in the UN in 1960 that the task is not simply to preserve the existing world, but to build a new one. He marshals a lot of theoretical resources to make this point, a philosophy of history that is akin to Marxism, that if we were to go against such a politics, one would have to justify themselves before the bar of history. So it's a deterministic, prophetic sort of philosophy of history. He universalizes the Pancasila, which is basically the state political theory of Indonesia. And more important, he starts by 1961 to introduce violence into this idea of third worldism. 1961 is the most important one because in the non-aligned movement in Belgrade, Sukarno starts to think of non-alignment not as mediation or third worldism, not as mediation, but as antagonistic between two different forces, the old established forces and the new emerging forces. So this is him reordering global politics. It's not about three different actors, first, second, and third world, but of two different ones, right? The old established forces are basically the forces of imperialism, colonialism, domination, hierarchy, and so on. And the new emerging forces are the forces of anti-colonialism, revolution, justice, post-colonial transformation, and so on. It's a bit vague, but that's the point. He wants to us to think of the world in different ways and uses language to do so. Non-aligned movement was his stage. It went directly against Nehru because Nehru was still specifically saying that the Cold War was the most important issue and therefore we should be thinking in three worlds. We should be thinking of peace and mediation, but Sukarno wants to go against that. Right. So non-alignment doesn't mean not going to left or right. It means active anti-colonial struggle. It was not neutrality. It is militancy against colonial and neo-colonial power. So it's not East versus West. It's North-South, basically. And so this gave him the resources to satisfy a military build-up against West Papua or West Irian to try to reclaim it, including by acquiring Soviet arms. So the discursive world making here basically wants to shift how we think about world politics and also allow the idea of violence to start to creep, or militancy to start to creep into this idea of third worldism, as opposed to moral violence of nations in 1955. It's more about, I invite you all to read the paper, but the basic idea I think I hope to have articulated. The second form is of institutional world making. Sukarno wanted to create institutions to embody the third world, to give the infrastructural basis to organize and to meet and so on, from which the third world could be seen as to be created as a single unit, not just in discourse, but actualized in institutions. So the context here, I think another context of the two institutions that I'm going to talk about. The context here is confrontasi against Malaysia. Basically, it's an undeclared low-intensity war against the Federation of Malaysia that was emerging at the time. Basically, to cut all to go straight to the heart of the problem, Sukarno saw Malaysia as a neo-colonial formation because it was British-backed. It's a federation that preserved imperial influence under the language of independence, but for Sukarno wasn't fully decolonized and in fact entrenched imperial influence in Southeast Asia. Of course, Malaysia is Indonesia's neighbor, right? So for Sukarno, because Malaysia represented this false decolonization, it contradicted his view that real decolonization required revolutionary rupture and sort of violent war of independence. His answer was this: to start a campaign to crush Malaysia, right? Basically inaugurating confrontasi, this low-intensity war. And at the time, of course, he needs to marshal anti-colonial sympathy, third worldist sympathy to his cause to say that Malaysia is not a viable decolonized object. And that's where the two institutions of the GANEFO and CONEFO come in. GANEFO is the Games of New Emerging Forces, CONEFO is Conference of New Emerging Forces. Very importantly, what we get to see here, when he creates these institutions, he actualizes the new emerging forces. They're not just discursive abstractions, they're not just languages, things that we say, but actual institutions from which people organize and come in and out, so to speak. Right. GANEFO emerges from the politics of sports. In 1962, Indonesia hosted the Asian Games, but out of third world solidarity, they refused visas from athletes from Taiwan and Israel, out of solidarity with the Chinese or Arab states. This caused a major dispute with the International Olympic Committee, and Indonesia was suspended. There's a lot more here. Nehru was the one that was seen to be championing a depoliticized conception of sports, which was associated with the Olympics. The Olympics, the big thing that the Olympics criticized Sukarno for was politicizing the issue. They said you shouldn't be denying visas because this is introducing politics into what should be a non-political institution. Sukarno, because kicked out of the Olympics, suspended from the Olympics committee, Sukarno's response was radicalization and to explicitly politicize sports. He argued that sports is already and always political. The Olympics and the Asian Games, the Olympic Council and the Asian Games, they claim neutrality, but what the neutrality does is really to conceal existing power relations. So this led Sukarno to create a different sort of sports institutions where the membership was based on anti-colonial credentials. So the GANEFO was not simply an alternative sports event, but here we can just glimpse the principles of an alternative international order in miniature, where the participants were not recognized states, they were unofficial delegations and representatives of new emerging forces. So we can have a Dutch delegation there, for example, as long as they show anti-colonial sympathies and anti-colonial action. The point was that legitimacy should not come from the recognition of the existing international system, but it could come from anti-colonial credentials. And there's a whole other principles there that I invite you all to read the paper for. But the basic idea is that the new emerging forces as a concept becomes institutionalized. Discursive categories become organizational forms, right? This is the second form of worldmaking that Sukarno puts forward. The same logic comes in the CONEFO. I'll just go through this very quickly. It's basically another platform for the new emerging forces, but it's imagined as a sort of a rival to the UN to challenge the legitimacy of the UN-centered order. And it really begins to start to gain steam after Indonesia becomes the first country actually to leave the United Nations in 1965 out of a dispute over Malaysia and so on. So institutional, but of course it never actually takes off, CONEFO, because Sukarno gets disposed in a coup, and I'll talk about that later. But this is basically what this does is to distinguish Sukarno from other anti-colonial figures, because it showed him to be rejecting the UN rather than embracing it, at this point anyway. So this is why it's a sort of both world-making and unworld-making. That's the idea that I'm trying to put forward. So the third form of world-making is dramaturgical. As mentioned earlier, it draws on Shimazu. It tries to move beyond speeches and institutions and looks at performance, spectacles, architecture, things more symbolic and less easy to intuitively grasp, but I think are still very important to see the cultural background and cultural effects, implications of worldmaking. Sukarno was a very flamboyant theatrical political figure, but the theatricality was a part of his politics. He understood world politics not just through treaties and institutions, but also the symbols, who gets to appear, the staging, manipulation of symbols and the audience, and so on. Right? And I discussed two different forms of worldmaking, of dramaturgical worldmaking. One is dramatic example setting. When Sukarno leaves the UN and he at the same time tells the United States to go to hell with your aid, it's not just meant as policy decisions, but as a public performance to dramatize this idea of refusal, to show to other post-colonial states that you can also exit. You don't have to just voice your frustrations with the international order. You can also do exit. It's to show use drama to show a different possibility. Right. That's so yeah. Of course, voice is to try to reframe the UN from within, which is what Sukarno initially did. But exit is to create new to leave and create alternative institutions. So the drama behind it is a form of anti-colonial pedagogy. It performs a defiance so that others might try to emulate it, but it doesn't work, of course. The second example is architecture. Sukarno trained as an architect. He cared deeply about the built environment, and under guided democracy, he redesigned or tried to redesign Jakarta as a stage of post-colonial grandeur, as a stage of a beacon for anti-colonialism. In fact, there's a lighthouse or beacon policy that he inaugurates. So the Asian Games, Ghana 4, and so on. In all these, the staging of all these events, monuments, stadiums, large urban spaces were all built to accompany these events, to try to turn Jakarta into this beacon of anti-colonial world-making. Scholars have tried to see this as a sort of nation building, but I think there's an idea of world making that goes behind it, because it shows the capital as a sort of global node in anti-colonialism. Buildings and monuments were used to signal that Indonesia was not just a new state, but a leader of the new emerging forces, which is what Sukarno himself coined. And more importantly, I think how architecture manages to shape Sukarno's speeches. His mass rallies had depended on large open spaces where the crowds could be assembled and choreographed. But the crowd was not just an audience and became a part of the performance, right? So in the little excerpt I put here, I try to show how Sukarno does this, because speeches, when Sukarno appears on the stage and gives a speech, it's not just the words that he uses that matter. You can't just look at the transcript and see what he says as a form of world-making. To see also about his performance, how he does it, and to try to bring the crowd with him as an actor in world-making. So he's a bit more like Freddie Mercury than he is like, in your traditional statesman, right? So speech is performance and not just discourse. Basically, that's the idea that I'm pushing forward. And architecture, as a form of dramaturgical world-making, is what enables Sukarno to do this. World-making, dramaturgical world-making includes affect, symbol, spectacle, culture, and so on. So basically, we've got the three forms of world-making here. But I didn't want to end the paper basically by saying that Sukarno has these forms of world-making and is something that we can emulate. Because I really like to try to get at the contradictions of his thought and to try to understand why he failed and the internal reasons why he failed. And so I identified three different forms, three different categories where his of course, for those of us who don't know, Sukarno's failure came together with one of the most gruesome massacres in the 20th century. At least conservative estimates of at least 500,000 people were slaughtered in the anti-communist massacre. And partially it was externally imposed. The United States was involved, but a lot of it was due to the internal contradictions in Sukarno's own project. So I identified three different categories in which the contradictions unfold. The first is a contradiction of history. Sukarno's politics, as I mentioned, was driven by a philosophy of history that was deterministic, prophetic, and tried to drive towards a better future, which he thought was inevitable. He draws this from Marxism, basically. Right? He believed that colonialism was obsolete, the future belonged to the new emerging forces. And he kept driving at this, but this created a gap that I identified between expectation and experience. The expectation was of post-colonial abundance, dignity, global transformation, but the experience that was happening in Indonesia was economic crisis, inflation, hyperinflation, and political instability. So basically, Sukarno's revolutionary language promised imminent transformation, but the material conditions did not match that promise. And then from there, he left Indonesians to live in the imagination of greatness while experiencing poverty. And so that contradiction starts to rub more and create the conditions for his demise, for his political downfall. The second contradiction is the contradiction of space. Sukarno wanted worldwide emancipation, but he was committed to a unitary Indonesian nation state. This is clearest in the idea of West Irian. For Sukarno, integrating West Irian completed Indonesian decolonization. But from a different perspective, it reproduced domination over people whose political futures were constrained. So basically, it became a form of Indonesian colonialism. Anti-colonialism, because it was entangled with the territorial logic of a post-colonial state, created these sort of contradictions. So it points at a broader problem where anti-colonial projects inherited the nation-state form while trying to transcend the colonial order that had shaped it. And then it leads to other contradictions in political economy. So I'll leave that to the paper if anybody wants to read it. And the third contradiction, very quickly, third contradiction is a contradiction of violence. So in Bandung, Sukarno spoke about moral violence, basically moral pressure and peace. But by 1960s, his politics became increasingly militant and increasingly violent, even though it didn't reach the same sort of levels as in many other places, of course. But there is a difference between anti-colonial insurgency against empire and the use of state military power by a post-colonial state. Confrontasi made this tension clear. Sukarno framed it as anti-colonial struggle against neo-colonial Malaysia, but many third world states were left unconvinced. They saw it as destabilizing, aggressive, self-defeating. So it leaves a question of when does anti-colonial violence become post-colonial militarism? And basically, Sukarno started to contradict himself, right? And so basically, the idea of violence in the third world was never really resolved by Sukarno. Yeah, and these three contradictions in his thought, I think, created the conditions for his political demise. So basically, to recap, the paper offers three contributions: a typology of worldmaking, discursive, institutional, dramaturgical, to try to make it worldmaking more analytically precise without closing down its flexibility. Secondly, it wants to bring Sukarno and Southeast Asia into debates on anti-colonial political thought and worldmaking, right? One that goes outside the UN rather than stays within it. And so, even though it ultimately failed, I think Sukarno's project was incredibly ambitious and it remains useful for us to think with. I think that's about it. I look forward to your comments. If anything, please read the paper. And if anybody wants to email me on this, I'm more than happy to respond. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jye, for a very excellent presentation. I think the big picture, the message is still relevant for many populist leaders in different parts of the world. But I will stop myself. Let's allow me to invite our first discussant, Dr. Patrick Neveling. Please, over to you.
Thank you. Congratulations on the publication, and thanks so much for the invitation also to Naumann. Thanks for having me. I read the journal article yesterday, read it a bit quickly, so it was good to have the update here. I want to make two main points. They're mainly also linked to the concept of world making. And so I very much appreciate that you have this person-based, politician-based, but also national case study here, and that you're kind of bringing this concept back into also a critical spotlight and not only an affirmative spotlight. So I think one of the key criticisms for world making is that it is a history of great, mostly men, just not Western men. And this, of course, means that it is not a history of Indonesia, it is a history of Sukarno. And I want to now first talk about the question of world making in a geopolitical context, and then about world making in a kind of interior political context of Indonesia. So if we look at Sukarno as a kind of historical person, we see that he has already kind of a role very important, what Parti Nasional Indonesia, PNI, that's his like historical power base, also well into the mid-1960s. And he goes into when the Japanese fascists invade Indonesia, he also works with them. He helps them set up army units, support units, and so on. He's also reluctant to declare independence in 1945. There's this episode when the students kind of kidnap him and so on. And throughout then his kind of political career, we see that he's also not only a very flamboyant politician, but also somebody who builds precarious coalitions and plays groups out against each other. When we then look at the role of Bandung and the Bandung Conference, then my concern is that to some extent, you make it quite clear in your paper, 61 is more crucial than 55. But in 55, we have Japan at the Bandung Conference. We have like British colonies at the Bandung Conference. So to me, the role of Bandung and also the non-aligned movement is to some extent it wasn't sufficiently prominent in the 90s and previous historiography and also geopolitical analysis, but now it's overly prominent in comparison to its actual kind of like punching weight or something like that. So this is world making and Sukarno on a geopolitical level. Very, very quickly, very briefly. Now, from a kind of interior perspective, we of course have the role of the leader of the Parti Komunis Indonesia, DNID, that is really important to consider here. Yeah, and at least from the NASACOM period, so Nacional, Agama, Kommunist, so nationalism, religious, Islamic belief, and communism. The PKI is the socialist, revolutionary, and mass movement backbone. Yeah. So when Sukarno speaks to masses, he doesn't speak to necessarily only followers of the PNE. He speaks to PKI followers, and he speaks on the kind of support of IDIT. At the same time, he also had a close alliance, and this is the Agama component, with the Nahdlatul Ulama, a kind of Islamic or later Islamist group that was very central to the 1965 massacres. So he, and I take this very much from when I studied Indonesian, or it was Austronesian languages back then in the 90s. We very much drew on actually historical books from East or socialist German historians, because they had a more critical analysis of interior politics of Indonesia. And they point out in consensus with also other more Marxist historians that he really plays out these groups against each other, and he has key responsibility also. And we shouldn't forget that the aggressive policy towards Malaysia is also designed to bring the army in. Yeah, because he, from 61 onwards, he gives a lot of political business concessions to the army, also in the expansion towards Papua. Yeah, so it's like a kind of expansion of a resource base that keeps three internally antagonistic actors at bay. Yeah, and that kind of blows up in 65. I'm not going to talk about the Chinese guns and stuff like that, but and of course the CIA is important here. West Germany, Deutsche Bank is really central in all these killings. So pre-mediated Christian Gerlach has shown that, others have shown that. Yeah, so that's important to keep in mind. So what I want to highlight here then in conclusion is that, like, also maybe to looking at cultural history. So one of my favorite Indonesian novels is, for example, Atheis by Achtiat Kata Miharja, the Angkatan 45 or Angkatan 65, yeah, so the big kind of like literary great generations of 45, 65, yeah. They stand for something that is much more universal than we maybe hear in the kind of world-making concept. They are much more online with the Johnson Forrest tendency, C.L.R. James, Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. So I was kind of grateful that you had this 1965 quote from Sidney Mintz, because I think Mintz doesn't mean it as positive as you make it. Yeah, and in that sense, then also final word is. And also the birth of Indonesian communism is, of course, that's a universalist movement born out of the kind of Dutch railway workers organizing trade unions in Indonesia in the 1910s, 1920s, and so on. So I think we actually, within Indonesia, we also see a clash of a kind of nationalist, violent third worldism that has its rationality, but also certain opportunism on Sukarno's end, and to me, a much more humanist global communist movement that was quite prominent across I rather say peripheries of the capitalist world system than the global south. So yeah, that in conclusion, I think comparison with Nehru, who was of course an opponent of Bose very happily working with the Japanese and German fascists. Nehru not so much, actually the opposite, would be interesting. Yes, I think there's a whole other history of Bandung to be considered and written. So thank you very much. I still very much appreciate your work.
Thank you, Patrick, for very useful feedback. Dr. Bowman, over to you, please.
Again, just like to extend my thanks for Naumann for having me, and also to say, Jye, that was really a really kind of stimulating paper. I also read the article yesterday, chewed through it. I really enjoyed it. What I want to do just briefly is basically chat about some of the stuff that I liked, and then using my kind of privileged position as a kind of comment, ask maybe one or two questions that you can either address at the end or just kind of let them float in the air. I really share this feeling that world-making literature is kind of risking losing its kind of analytical purchase at the moment through this overextension that we see, right? And I think your typology that you offer, this kind of three strands, is giving a kind of vocabulary distinguishing what kind of world making is happening. And I think often that's a bit lost in the kind of ever-growing conversations, without losing that comparative element, which I think is really compelling. I think your kind of insistence that the dimensions are relational rather than autonomous is good. And I think, again, this kind of recovery of Sukarno as a serious political theorist, rather than merely the kind of, instrumental, kind of unsystematic actor, is really kind of compelling. And I think you execute that really well. The kind of like discursive reading, Quentin Skinner-esque kind of reading of speeches, new emerging forces, old established forces. I think that's really compelling because you're rooting it in the context, but intervening rather than just reproducing, which I think we see a lot with this kind of, from my side as a book historian, we see a lot of the reproduction rather than the intervention. But for me, the dramaturgical dimension is the most exciting. I think, again, when I read, Shimazu's Diplomacy as Theatre a couple of years ago, it struck me that there was a lot more going on here. And I think Sukarno as an architect really lends itself to this. And I particularly like when you're talking about the redesign of Jakarta as a world-making act in itself, right, rather than merely nation building. I also think I've done a bit of work in the past on Nehru and Krishna Menon, and I think the comparison with Nehru and Sukarno is a really fruitful one. This kind of, I think you call it like a distillation of the fracture of the third world. That I think, I think it's Bhardwaj that you draw on this kind of characterizing Nehru as, he approaches colonialism with a sense of closure, whereas Sukarno, it's open and it's urgent, right? And I think that's really, really compelling. And again, the way that you read things like Bandung or Belgrade through these different lenses allows us to kind of, maybe compare a little bit the kind of temporal political orientation that's going on here, right? Colonial as a residual problem versus colonialism as the kind of structuring antagonism. So I really enjoyed the kind of this Nehru-Sukarno comparison particularly. The kind of questions then, so two things that I kind of would like to hear your thoughts on, or I just want to put out there. So the typology you present is kind of non-exhaustive, right? And it's analytically separable but relational. I think this makes sense, this is how it has to be, but I wonder whether the three dimensions to you carry equal weight, or is one kind of logically prior? So like in Sukarno's case, it seems like the discursive seems to generate to an extent the institutional, and this is then what enables the dramaturgical. So is that a kind of contingent feature of this case, or does it suggest maybe a kind of latent hierarchy in the framework as a whole? And then the other thing that I wanted to quickly flag, in the contradictions section, the way that you frame Sukarno's project and the collapse through this notion, I think you call it untimeliness, which I think is really a nice framing. Does it, maybe this is slightly provocative, does this kind of risk a kind of retrospective fatalism? So is there a version of this story where different choices about violence or about nation state formation or economic strategy, whether that could have altered the trajectory, right? Or whether these contradictions are actually structural? So the three contradictions that you highlight with Sukarno's world-making project specific to Sukarno, or really are they contradictions of anti-colonial world-making more broadly? But like I said, I really enjoyed reading it. I appreciate the kind of time to offer some thoughts. And, I look forward to hearing kind of any answers you have, but also I know we're kind of pressed for time. So if you don't have a lot of time for answers, but I will hand over there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bowman, for your excellent feedback. Roqiyul?
Thank you, Dr. Riayat. Thank you for inviting me to join again. To Quah, hello. Thank you for your presentation and your paper. I find it very thought-provoking, not just for your subject, political studies, international relation, international law maybe, but for me as a constitutional law student. Actually, I don't have a specific question about your published work, but I've made a reflective note. As an Indonesian student, I feel that studies on Sukarno's ideas, whether on the Bandung Conference or the drafting of the original Indonesian Constitution, have largely been overlooked and undervalued. Even in Indonesia, including after the 1998 reforms that ended Suharto's rule. For over 30 years, Suharto's government tried to remove Sukarno's influence from almost every part of national life in Indonesia, which we often called that as de-Sukarnoization. Social and political life in Indonesia after Sukarno changed a lot during that time, as Suharto brought Indonesia back into the UN, for example. Also, further example to me, I think only educated young Indonesians today know that the Indonesian Parliament building was first built as the headquarters of the CONEVO in 1965. And also, to me, today, in Indonesia, through Sukarno's ideas and the Bandung Conference, no longer seems to represent third worldism, as you wrote, or the spirit of decolonization. After Sukarno, Indonesia seems to have joined the mainstream neoliberal political order and now lacks a clear alternative from Indonesian lens, right? In constitutional studies, for example, guided democracy under the original Indonesian constitution, which I see as anti-colonial constitution, even Pancasila, is often viewed only through the lens of liberal democracy. Because of this, talking about Sukarno, the Bandung Conference, or the original constitution in Indonesia is often seen as trying to bring back authoritarianism or moral violence, as perhaps in line with the sixth section of your paper, right? In conclusion, I really appreciate your work. Through your paper, you contribute to reviving Sukarno's thought and anti-colonial ideas from Southeast Asia, bringing them back into the center of scholarly discussion as it to me, it is kind of fighting de-Sukarnoization, right? The challenge now is how to keep moving this kind of research forward. And also, there's an idea of a pending future for the Bandung conference, which I'm sure that you have also read in the book entitled Bandung, Global History and International Law, Critical Past and Pending Futures by Luis Eslava, Michael Fahri, and Vasuki Nesaya. That is all. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Riayat.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Roqiyul, for a very legal alternative perspective. So, Jye, you have now historical, philosophical, legal perspectives. Let's go to Deedan for political perspective. Deedan, over to you.
Thank you, Noman, for having me again. I'm not really political. I've been following Quah's work for about like 2 years, and I saw this opportunity as a continuation of discussion. And thanks for previous comments from Dr. Neveling, Dr. Bowman, and Roqiyul. Actually, I'd like to start by saying how much I enjoyed Quah's paper. I think it's brilliant how Quah uses Sukarno's case to not only understand the historical, the under-discussed empirical case of Sukarno itself, but also to contribute to political theory, which is quite ambitious, even from Indonesian scholars who try to do so. I don't think few can do it as good as Quah did. And I also enjoyed these 3 dimensions when they try to Quah tried to analytically understood Sukarno's case. But across these dimensions, there's one question in my mind. Does your reconceptualization, if I may say, of word making examine agency of the subject under study, in this case Sukarno? Was Sukarno really world making or world unmaking, as you mentioned, very interesting early in the page 573? Or was he actually world made by the forces around him? Starts from the first dimension, the discursive one, so which is all about his speeches. Quah points out how Sukarno's words significantly affect global politics, but I recently read Chris Morehouse's book titled Merdeka. It is a biography of a British man who helped Sukarno. Yeah. So finally, you read the copy. So some key speeches delivered by Sukarno was written by a British man. He was even working for government of Indonesia as a civil servant for quite some time. Even though Atkinson did disclaim that it was not his idea, he just translated Sukarno's idea into English, but still, to make a moving English words, language still instrumental, and people who can come up with the words would also instrumental. So how you see the agency of Sukarno in this speech making, and also to the institutional dimension, for example. Quah considers Sukarno as central to the Bandung Conference, but I've just read Andreas Benvenuti's book, Nehru's Bandung. It was published in 2024. He argued that it was Ali Sastroamidjojo, it was the Prime Minister of Indonesia back then, who initiated, who actually had the idea of the Bandung Conference, and later being supported by Nehru. So I don't see here from the book that Sukarno was truly central. Yet maybe you got a point that your institutional assessment was quite spot on, because you mentioned more about how Sukarno's did with Ganevo, Conevo, and so on and so forth. But your claim about the centrality of Sukarno in the Bandung Conference was quite challenging to accept by the Nehru's Bandung book. There's also a bit dark irony, as mentioned by Dr. Neveling earlier, that there was Japan was involved in the Bandung Conference. And it also brings up a really uncomfortable fact. During the World War II, Sukarno actually collaborated with the Japanese authorities in Indonesia, helping to recruit Indonesian forced laborers, Romusha, that's widely popular now known. So yeah, the institutional stage at Bandung in 1955 is kind of complicated on its own. And lately, it's also connected with the Japanese involvement on the dramaturgical dimension. And I echo what Dr. Bowman said. There was a lot going on at the time. But I was interested in how Sukarno get funding to do such a lighthouse, a beacon policy at the time. As you mentioned in the page 581. In a book by Masashi Nishihara, the title is Japanese and Sukarno's Indonesia. Sukarno really depended on foreign money, and in this case from Japan, war reparation or war compensation. He used a lot of money for prestige projects like national monument, luxury hotels. Practically speaking, even for Indonesia's rocketry, I'm doing research in space policies, and we are very well in depth to Japanese money to kickstart the project. That's how Japanese were involved in making Sukarno, who was eager to do that, because he practically had the money to do so. So to sum up, you're doing very great. You gives us a really great way to think about worldmaking. Sukarno not only as something to analyze, but in fact enrich the theoretical discussions in political theory. So yeah, thank you very much. Back to you, Noman.
Thanks, Ethan, for your comments. Sergey, all said, all done. Ball is in your court. Feel free to respond to the comments.
Thank you so much for all your comments. Dr. Neveling, let me pick up this one. Your idea of the literature where Indonesia during Sukarno's later tenure is characterized by this three-headed monster between the army, the communists, and Sukarno, is become one that I think I'm going to make a very big claim here, is that I've never been convinced by that picture, right? And it gets reproduced everywhere, and I think of course it has some sort of, it must have some sort of empirical basis, but I always wondered whether it constrains our way of seeing Sukarno's tenure, or does it actually enable us to think about it more? Because Sukarno becomes, when we take that picture, all of Sukarno's world-making or foreign policy adventures become seen to be reduced to trying to balance that coalition, right? So it becomes very difficult, for example, to see Confrontasi as an anti-colonial venture, as opposed to it being seen as something of Sukarno's own internal political maneuvers. So in that way, world-making becomes very difficult. The world-making of Sukarno becomes difficult to grasp. So when I was writing the paper, and actually a lot of the questions that were put forward here are covered in my dissertation. But yeah, so it's something that I tried to break out of. But of course, I do so with, as you say, there's so much going on in Indonesia, but I do so with some trepidation, because I know that I could be swimming too much against the existing literature. So that's what I will cryptically put out there. But thank you very much for those comments. Dr. Bowman, thank you so much for those as well. The untimeliness point, I guess I'll focus on that one. It was a much bigger point in the first submission to the journal, and then later on it started getting there's a bit too much going on, I guess, and I started to reduce it a bit more in the final version. But yeah, it gets covered quite a lot in my dissertation, where I'm trying to track the shift in third worldist mood, in third worldist political thought, especially with a pivot around 1965, where it goes from a sense of momentum to a sense of closure. And so Sukarno here becomes a microcosm of a much larger third world shift, where third worldist regimes, statesmen, the populations start to realize that we're not going to get what we were promised for, or what we were promised. And we're not going to be able to change the world that we thought we were able to. And so Sukarno is sort of becomes a tragic figure I think, in my dissertation, where this sort of he's acting out of time, basically. If he had acted, if the possibilities were there 10, 15 years earlier, it might have been a different issue. But time moves on and it doesn't manage to do it, and with the most tragic circumstances, of course. There's a lot more to say. Hopefully, maybe you can extend the conversation after this this meeting. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Bang. Thank you, Bang. I'll go straight to Megawati and the PDIP. Now, right? What does Sukarno represent in Megawati's vision? Right, which is this one I always found very sad. I mean, if you saw 2022, she gave this speech in the celebration of the Bandung Conference, Non-Aligned Movement, Tricontinental. She starts saying, Sukarno is an anti-colonial figure, the UN, thus referring to how the UN has constrained us and so on. But when you look at the actual imagination in the documents of the PDIP, Sukarno has become defanged as a radical figure, right? Now Sukarno's thought is just about, I mean, it's important, yes, caring for the poor, economic populism, but Sukarno did so much more. So it's a bit of a frustration here that the PDIP is basically, I wouldn't say a monopoly on Sukarno's thought, but they're the leaders here, but they've also tried to reduce what he can be. So it's a bit irritating, right? But I guess for political reasons, it is useful as to moderate and so on. So yeah. So then the Chris Morehouse point is really, really important, interesting. But as you mentioned, right, he himself doesn't want to discredit Sukarno. So I take his word for it that he is less of a speech writer, more of an interpreter of Sukarno. But also we shouldn't forget, I think, that Sukarno spoke very good English, right? He spoke very good French, spoke very good Dutch, and very, very good Dutch, and so on. So I didn't want to take it away from him so much. And also the important thing also that I noticed, because so Tom Atkinson wrote, he said his tenure with Sukarno was 55 to 61, and then there's a gap, and then I think from 63 or 64 or something like that. So it's interesting to see the gap in between, whether things change. And actually, if you look at it, things don't really change. So that was my sort of license to say, like, actually, Tom Atkinson was important, but I wouldn't use it to take anything away from Sukarno. So yeah, we should definitely continue this conversation. There's a lot more that I want to say here, but I am not managed to. Thank you so much for your participation in this in the paper. I'm very glad to have received this feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jye, for excellent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Patrick, Dr. Jack, Roqiyul, Deedan, for your excellent comments. I'm sure Jye have found these comments very useful and will shape probably the next paper or the monograph in the future. So the Global South Network warmly welcomes any PhD student from any part of the world in any discipline. If you, any of the PhD students wish to present their PhD project, or anyone wants to participate, feel free to get in touch with me at the email leakgsn@gmail.com. Same time next week, let's meet our next guest speaker, the details of which will be communicated to you through weekly newsletter. Until then, stay tuned, follow our social media sites. The details will be uploaded very soon. Thank you very much. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Right.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Jye.